Awesome. Awesome. All right. So let's get into it. So where we left off last week was on page 8. And it's actually one of my favorite transition points in the whole book. Because where we left off was Bill Wilson. And at the top of page 8, we see really Bill Wilson take his step 1. He's gone to the town's hospital. I'm doing a little bit of review. He's gone to the town's hospital twice. And his first trip to the town's hospital, he learned that he has alcoholism, and he learned about the physical allergy, and he learned about the mental obsession, and he had his self-knowledge, and then he relapsed. And he goes back to the town's hospital where he learns that he's going to die of alcoholism, that this is fatal, and that he is hopeless, and he relapses. And on the top of page 8, he talks about how he's at that place of absolute hopelessness, where no words can tell of the loneliness, the despair. He's surrounded. He's done. He's met his match. He's overwhelmed. Alcohol is his master. He's done, and he knows it. And really, that for me is Bill Wilson's step 1. But he's got no solution to surrender to, or no program of action to take. So he drinks again. And so where we pick up is near the end of that bleak November. And for those of us who are in Alberta right now, it might seem a little bleak with our foot of snow, but it is not. It is always darkest before the dawn. And that's where we're going to pick up with Bill. So it says, near the end of that bleak November, I sat drinking in my kitchen. With a certain satisfaction, I reflected that there was enough gin concealed about the house to carry me through that night and the next day. My wife was at work. And again, we were speaking about Bill and how his wife was supporting him and how he's not living up to those expectations that he set and the shame that he must feel. He says, I wondered whether I dared hide a full bottle of gin near the head of our bed. I would need it before daylight. Again, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to relate to Bill. I'm trying to relate to his symptoms. I can always ask myself, hey, did I ever hide booze? Did I ever hide alcohol? Is that my experience, right? And it was for me. And I had an experience. I'll just kind of share this with you. It was a couple of years ago. So, and I've been sober, I'm coming up on 13 years. So I've been sober a little while. But a little while ago, I saw, oh, thank you, that's lovely. I saw that my mom had put, like she had found some, or she had a thing of wine, and she had like put it behind the toilet, probably because it wouldn't fit in the tank. And I'm like, girl, that is amateur hour. She's not an alcoholic. She was just a little codependent, and I think tried to hide it from me. It's like, we know about the toilet tank, and we know it keeps it chilled. But like that tends to be our experience. So it says, my musing was interrupted by the telephone. The cheery voice of an old school friend asked if he might come over. So if you're writing in your books, what I would ask is we make a note that this is Ebby Thatcher. And if you remember from when we did the history, Ebby Thatcher, he's going to be bringing to Bill the information of what our solution is and what our program of action is. And if you remember from last week when Bill was trancing around the graveyard, it probably wasn't trancing, but when he was in the graveyard, he saw that graveyard that had the name Thatcher, Thomas Thatcher. His childhood friend, Ebby Thatcher, is now giving him a ring on the phone. And it says in italics, he was sober. And so it is in italics, one, because italics, and for those who joined us just now, we're on page 9, welcome. He was sober is in italics because italics offer emphasis, right? And in modern time, I hit Control-I on my computer, little keyboard shortcut for you, and I can just make it italics. Now, in the 1930s, when the book Alcoholics Anonymous was in monolith printing, when it was going to go to the printer, to actually put something in italics meant that they would actually have to go in and physically change the typeface in the printing machine, which cost money. I don't know about you guys. Go to your local home group or your home group and bring up anything that costs money and see how well that goes, right? And so these are some broke as a joke early AA alcoholics that are trying to scrape together enough money to write this book. And if there's anything in italics, that means that about 100-ish drunks, 80 really, and more of the ones in New York than Akron, agreed it was important enough to spend money on it. So again, whenever we see italics, it's extra, extra, extra important. And so he says he was sober. And that means there is something remarkable about his friend Ebby Thatcher being sober. This is not a normal condition. There's something remarkable. So he says it was years since I could remember his coming to New York in that condition. Again, I want to remind you the condition of sobriety. It's been years since Ebby showing up to New York sober. What's this about? I was amazed. Rumor had it that he had been committed for alcoholic insanity. So he's saying the rumors going around was that Ebby, he was thrown into an asylum as the result of his alcoholism. I wondered how he had escaped. Now, I think what Bill actually means is I wonder how he got out of that one. But how I visualize it is I wonder how Ebby tied together a bunch of bed sheets and shimmied down the window, right? Not how he successfully completed his treatment program. I don't think that's what he means. That's just what I'm reading into it. So, of course, so I wondered how he escaped. Of course, he would have dinner and then I could drink openly with him. Unmindful of his welfare, I thought only of recapturing the spirit of other days. There was that time we had chartered an airplane to complete a jag. His coming was an oasis in this dreary desert of futility. The very thing, an oasis. Drinkers are like that. And so what an oasis is, like a desert, it's a pretty hopeless place, right? And Bill's really lost in that desert. The quicksand is stretched around him in all directions. And there's this oasis, this place of paradise, a reprieve, a respite for him. And it's his buddy Ebby coming and showing up, and we're gonna tie one off together. We're gonna have a good drinking time. And so I want you to know, when I read this, especially at first, I'm like, what are we on about? You know what I mean? Like, who the heck cares? Really? Like, you chartered an airplane to complete a jag? Like, okay, you fancy drinker, I could barely find my shoes. You know what I mean? I didn't get the point of this paragraph. So it's important for me that what Bill is doing in this little paragraph is doing what Bill did for us in his first 8 pages. So he's taking one paragraph to qualify Ebby Thatcher. Really, what he's saying is like, hey guys, Ebby's an alcoholic. Ebby's like me. And there's this rumor that like Bill would always say like, hey, if I ever get as bad as Ebby, I'll quit, right? So what we know is that Bill knows Ebby. Bill and Ebby, they drank together, and that Bill knows that Ebby is an alcoholic of the hopeless variety. And again, what is an alcoholic of the hopeless variety? One that has the physical allergy. Once I start to drink, I cannot stop. And the mental obsession. When I say, I am not going to drink again, I don't have the ability to stay sober, and I drink again. And so that thing about the chartered an airplane to complete a jag, it's one of those things I was like, oh, you're a little fancy, a little hoity-toity. But there's Bill's wife, Lois, wrote a book. And it's called Lois Remembers, because she's the Al-Anon. And so she remembers. And so I really love hearing this story. Now, keep in mind, I don't normally go to other books. I usually just keep it in the big book. But I love hearing from Lois's point of view what this drunken plane ride actually looked like. Because when I heard this story, I'm like, oh yeah, that sounds familiar. So she goes on to write, whenever his work, she's talking about Bill, whenever his work took him near Albany, that's a city in New York, Bill would stop in to see his old friend Ebby, and they always got drunk together. On one of these sprees, a brilliant idea hit them. I know I have had many a brilliant idea while drinking. Ebby had heard that a new airfield was about to be opened by the Equinox House in Manchester, Vermont. They hired a plane, wired the time of arrival to Miss Orvis, the owner of the hotel, and stocked up well for the flight. Stocked up well means they grabbed a lot of alcohol. It was a gala day for Manchester. Miss Orvis called out the band to greet the first plane to arrive at the new airport. So there's a band, there's a banner. It's a big, important deal. And the town fathers all gathered at the airfield. The plane flew in, the band played lustily, the welcoming committee got ready, and Bill and Ebby stepped down from the plane and fell flat on their faces, dead drunk. Just hearing that story, I'm like, ooh, yeah, it just helped color in the history for me. So they had quite the story. So going back to page 9, the door opened and he stood there, fresh-skinned and glowing. There was something about his eyes. He was inexplicably different. What had happened? And this is a really powerful moment. Ebby Thatcher has carried a message to Bill, a real message, and he hasn't even opened his mouth. When we get into there's a solution, there's a line that says that it talks about my responsibility to sponsees, how I as a sponsor ought to show up when working with newcomers. And it says that his whole deportment shouts at the new man, at the prospect that he is a man with a real answer. Ebby Thatcher is there in the doorway, and you can see he's got a real answer. There's something different about him. And when he talks about there was something about his eyes, for those of us who've been around the rooms, we know what he's talking about there. And you know what it's like when you see a newcomer come in. And goodness, if you haven't had this happen yet, come, stick around, do this work and be a part of this thing, because it's a miracle. But to watch an alcoholic come in and that light is dark and they're hopeless and they're beaten down, and you see them start to do this work, and it's usually kind of around step 4, column 4, when we realize that we're the jerks. And that light starts to come on in their eyes, and you can see it. And it's this most incredible thing. And I mean, he has carried a message, a real message, and he hasn't said a word. And that message gets Bill to ask what had happened. It gets Bill curious. I pushed a drink across the table. He refused it, disappointed, but curious. I wondered what had gotten into the fellow. He wasn't himself. Yeah, he's not drinking. This is weird, you guys. He is not drinking. It is weird. And again, a reminder that a sober, recovered alcoholic, man, that is an unusual state. In fact, it's so unusual, one might call it a miracle. So, what's all this about? I queried. So he asked him, hey, what's all this about? He looked straight at me, simply but smilingly. He said, I've got religion. Now, keep in mind, I'm just going to break down the history just a little bit. We have this fellow by the name of Roland Hazard, and we can check him out on page 28 if you want. Like, I'm not going to read through it, but you can follow along. Roland Hazard, he comes from this super incredibly wealthy family, and just rich. And he struggles with alcoholism, and he tries every known thing that he can think of in the United States to get sober and stay sober. Then he gets drunk time and time again. And he goes to Europe to see Carl Jung. And he works one-on-one with Carl Jung for a year. And he drinks again. And he goes back to Carl Jung and says, dude, what's up with that? I mean, probably more eloquently, but I like to summarize as, dude, what's up with that? And Carl Jung says, I misdiagnosed you. You're an alcoholic. And the only solution that I've ever found for people like you, people that have alcoholism, is a spiritual awakening, a spiritual experience. But the odds of this thing happening to you are about the odds of you getting struck by lightning. So you can't just hang out in a church pew on a Sunday and hope this thing happens for you. You've got to go out and seek it and find it. Like, this is a 1 in a million sort of thing. And so Roland Hazard goes out. And he goes and he finds this thing called the Oxford movement, this Oxford group. And they're a bunch of middle class upper middle class people that happen to be religious. They happen to be Christian, and their whole purpose was having a deep experience of the God of their understanding. And Roland Hazard's like, oh, I need one of those. So he gets involved with the Oxford group, knowing that the solution is a spiritual awakening. And the Oxford group has a series of actions which later became our 12 steps that allowed people to have a spiritual awakening. And because the Oxford group happened to be religious in nature, that's what Ebby Thatcher's talking about. So Roland Hazard, he works the steps, he is an awakening, he stays sober, and he carries the message to Ebby Thatcher. And I'm going to describe the carrying the message here in a paragraph. But I want to point out that that's what it's talking about. That happens to be religious, 12-step, not religious. If you are in for a particular religion, awesome, wonderful. And if not, awesome, wonderful. If you're agnostic or atheist, wonderful. We can work with that. We can meet you where you're at. And so Bill Wilson, I just want to point out, because when we read through Bill's story, I always want to see where I relate and how I relate. And I want to do that with his alcoholism, but I also, I'll be honest, I want to do that with his barriers to this thing. So Bill Wilson, page 8, no words can tell of the loneliness, the despair, quicksand stretch around him in all direction. I've met my match, I am overwhelmed. Alcohol is my master, I am hopeless. What I would not give to change my life, I'm done, I'm beaten. And before him stands a miracle, a man that he knows is an alcoholic like him who is sober. And he can see the light is on. And the man says, I've got religion. And Bill Wilson, being as open-minded as only the dying can be, I was aghast. I was aghast. So that was it. Last summer, an alcoholic crackpot. Now I suspected a little cracked about religion. He had that starry-eyed look. Yes, the old boy was on fire, right? But bless his heart, let him rant. Besides, my gin would last longer than his preaching, immediately dismissing what he sees in front of him, right? And have I not done that? Have I not come to the rooms and seen people that were happy and sober at the same time and wanted to judge and dismiss and think, no, that couldn't happen for me? And I just love the saying, bless his heart. For the Canadians in here, that's not a kind saying. It sounds like it would be. Bless his heart? That sounds like your heart? I want your heart to be blessed. Delightful. But if you go to the South, you'll know that that is quite a condescending term. It's a little like keep coming back, right? It can be lovely on the face of it, but you can also kind of weaponize keep coming back if you've ever been a little, not that I would ever, but if you've ever been a little passive aggressive or had shared one of your brilliant ideas, like I know I have, and had your sponsor say to you, like mine, oh, keep coming back, which is an indication it might not be a good idea, just if you're wondering. So he says, hopeless as the dying can be. And he opens himself up, and opens himself up to the miracle that stands before him and closes right there again. And I love this. He says, but he did no ranting. My job is not to yell at you. My job is not to convince you. My job is not to make you do it. My job is simply to lay down the simple kit of spiritual tools. In a matter-of-fact way, he told how two men had appeared in court, persuading the judge to suspend his commitment. They had told of a simple religious idea, and that is a spiritual awakening is enough to overcome alcoholism. That is our solution. And if you're writing in your book, you can make a little note. And a practical program of action for us today, that's our 12 steps. Again, if you're writing in your book, you can make a little note. And so what happened is Ebby Thatcher, he had gotten into some trouble with the law. And there's two main stories he did. I can't ever remember which was the one that he got in trouble, like he was on trial for. One of the ones was he was drinking and driving, as we sometimes do. And he was in rural Vermont. And you might, I don't know if anyone here has been to the, northeast part of the United States. I haven't, but I'm imagining there's not too much there. Especially in the 1930s. And he managed, rural Vermont, to crash into an old lady's farmhouse and roll down the window and ask for a cup of coffee, which, I mean, the alcoholic audacity, I love it. Now, the other thing that and again, if we can relate to that, wonderful, and if not, that's okay. But the other thing that he did he was drinking, again, rural Vermont. He was drinking, and you know, when you get a couple beers in and you get a little ambitious-y, you get a little like a project or two on the go, he decided that he was going to paint his house. Now, he started painting his house. I don't think he got all the way through, as we tend not to. And then there were some birds. And birds do what birds do. And he was like, they are going to ruin this new paint on the house. So he does the only logical thing that any of us could ever do. He gets a shotgun and starts shooting at them, which even in rural Vermont in the 1930s, not cool. So he was on trial for one of those two incidents. Can't remember which one. And one of the miracles about this whole deal is he's on trial the exact week that Roland Hazard, he's got knowledge of the solution, a spiritual awakening, and he's got knowledge of the program of action, those 12 steps. The exact week he happens to be visiting home, right? And so when he says how two men had appeared in court, it was Shep Cornell, Roland Hazard, and Seba Graves. And the judge happened to be Seba Graves's father. And Roland Hazard, he's visiting, and you know, the friend is on trial, and so they're going to go see if they can do anything, because Roland had some luck with his sobriety. And you know, here's the thing: the rich guys in the 1930s, they don't got a lot of other things to do probably than gossip about each other, to be honest with you. And I wonder if Seba Graves had not heard about Roland Hazard's drinking, and heard about his struggles to stop, and heard about that something was different about Roland. Because he allowed Ebby Thatcher to go. He said, you better be sober on Monday, otherwise I'll throw you in the clink. But he probably didn't say clink, but I'll throw you in jail. And so Roland Hazard offers Ebby Thatcher these 12 steps. Well, they weren't the 12 steps yet, but six steps. And he gets well, and he has a spiritual awakening. And one of the things I want to point out, it says that was 2 months ago. And the result was self-evident. It worked. 2 months. I really want to emphasize, it does not take long to get well here. It does not take long to do the steps. It does not take long to have a spiritual awakening. It does not take long to carry this message to others. And I mean that, and I don't mean that in a shaming way. If you haven't had that experience yet, I mean that in a loving and an encouraging way. Let us help you take those steps and have that experience. If you're in pain, if you're struggling, if you're relapsing, if you're new, let us help you. It does not take long to get well, and it does not take long to work with others. My life hung in the balance of a man 2 months sober doing a 12-step call. It does not take long to work with others. And so I just think that's so important, that we want to get us through this work, and not that we're ever done. It is a way of life. But it doesn't take long to work with others. And the fact that he's 2 months sober and he can see the change. Now what we're going to get into is Bill Wilson, his struggling and his wrestling with the step 2 idea. Keep in mind, Bill Wilson, he's drunk on gin at his kitchen table. You know what I mean? And he's going to wrestle with the step 2. And I think there's value in watching Bill Wilson wrestle with the step 2. Step 2 being, can I believe that there's a power greater than myself? And can I believe that that power can relieve for me that insane thought that I have to take that first drink? That's step 2. And Bill Wilson's going to wrestle with it. We're going to see him open up, and we're going to see him close, and we're going to see him open up, and we're going to see him close. And what I want us to do is watch and see, have we been closed in the way that Bill Wilson was closed? Have we been resisted in the way Bill was resistant? Because if we can relate to that, we can relate to him opening up again. So he said he had come to pass his experience along to me if I cared to have it. I was shocked, but interested. Certainly I was interested. I had to be, for I was hopeless. And if you've been coming to this thing for a while, I always want to emphasize hopeless, 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 hopeless. Because when I'm able to see the reality of my condition as an alcoholic, which is hopeless, I'm able to grab onto the hope that's on offer, even if there's a little bit of fight in me. So it says he talked for hours. Childhood memories rose before me. I could almost hear the sound of the preacher's voice as I sat on still Sundays, way over there on the hillside. So what he's talking about is he's sitting on the side of the hill and overhearing the preacher talk in church. There was that proffered temperance pledge I never signed. A proffered temperance pledge, that was kind of like a pledge that you had signed that was a promise that I would never drink. Bill Wilson didn't sign that. Another way to look at it, for those of us who kind of grew up in the era of the DARE program, kind of like the DARE program, like I'm never going to use drugs, DARE program. Or, and this is a very small window of people, and I'm actually too old for this reference, but if you guys remember the Jonas Brothers, and they had those rings that they would wear, it's like an example of they're like, I'm not going to have sex, like they're chastity rings. It's almost like that, like a symbol of, but for drinking. So and he never signed it. He wasn't doing that. So, and then he says, my grandfather's good-natured contempt of some church folks and their doings, his insistence that the Spears really had their music, but his denial of the preacher's right to tell him how he must listen, his fearlessness as he spoke of these things just before he died. These recollections welled up from the past. They made me swallow hard. So you might not know what he's talking, because I sure as heck. Proffered temperance pledge, preacher's voice, Spears have their music. What are we talking about? So Bill Wilson, his parents divorced, and it, like, I think his dad and mom kind of just almost abandoned him. He was raised in much of his formative years by his grandfather. And his grandfather actually had one of those 1 in a million spiritual awakenings, a spiritual experience. And what he's saying is this: his grandfather, who had such a impact on who he was as a person, who raised him, he believed in a God, he believed in a power greater than himself, but he wasn't in for church, that good-natured contempt of some church folks and their doing. So he thought, nah, I don't need any of that. And then when his grandfather was on his deathbed, a time where maybe you might be more open, or a time where there's a lot of fear and you might be wanting to accept different things that maybe you didn't at different parts of your life, he stood firm in his belief that, no, I believe what I believe. You don't have to have a minister come in and do the last rites. I believe what I believe. And so that's his barrier to step 2. Something else is the Spears really had their music. This was a theory that as the planets rotated on their axis and as they orbited around the sun, I assume is what they orbit around the sun, that they made an audible sound. So that's this idea that the Spheres have their music, that they make a sound. And turns out they do. You can go on YouTube and listen to the sounds the planets make. And Saturn is horrifying. It is absolute nightmare fuel. I know we're past Halloween, but if you're just wanting to just give yourself a fright after the study, not during, but after the study, if you want, go on YouTube and listen to Saturn. It's terrifying. But it's that idea that there must be something to life. There must be a power greater than ourselves. But he's not going to believe, necessarily in Christianity, or at least what the preachers are saying. He's closed for that. And so that made him swallow hard. He's saying, no, I believe what I believe. And it says that wartime day in old Winchester Cathedral came back. And that's that reference to page 1 in the book, when Bill Wilson is in the cathedral and he has this moment of the presence of God with him. That moment opens him up again, right? And he's in that cathedral, and he has that moment of God, and also, he goes and he goes outside and he sees that tombstone, Thomas Thatcher, and who's before him, Ebby Thatcher. Just the synchronicity of that moment. And so here's what Bill Wilson is open to, and we're on page 10 if you've just joined us, mid page 10. He said, I had often believed in a capital P power, and I'm going to be annoying because anytime it's capitalized, I'm going to point it out, because those capitalizations are synonyms that we can use. If we're not a fan of the word God, we don't have to use the word God. We can use the word capital P power. And that's what we're talking about when we see those words. We're talking about God in whatever manifestation that you are the most open to. So he said, I have always believed in a power greater than myself. I'd often pondered these things. I was not an atheist. Few people really are. For that means blind faith in the strange proposition that this universe originated in a cipher and aimlessly rushes nowhere. My intellectual heroes, the chemists, the astronomers, even the evolutionists, suggested vast laws and forces at work. Despite contrary indications, I had little doubt that a mighty purpose and rhythm underlay all. How could there be so much precise and immutable law and no intelligence? I simply had to believe in a capital S, capital U, Spirit of the universe, who knew neither time nor limitation. But that was as far as I'd gone. So that's what he's open to. And how Bill describes it in some of his talks is it was almost the God of science. This idea that if there's, and this is something we're going to talk about more in We Agnostics. But if we have the ability to have physics, right? Like if I'm able to pick up my phone and drop my phone, if I drop it under the same conditions, I can calculate the rate at which it will fall. I can calculate its velocity every single time. Right now it's snowing, and I know it's snowing. I know it's snowing because it's below zero. And 0 degrees Celsius, I'm so sorry for those who are doing Fahrenheit. I think it might be similar. I don't know. But the water freezes. Water molecules freeze below 0 degrees. Now I know there's things like altitude, and they boil. It turns into a gas at above 100 degrees Celsius. So what he's saying is like there are these laws, like plants. They know to grow their leaves based on a Fibonacci number sequence, so they get the most sun. He's like there is something behind this. There are these laws and these forces at work. How could there be nothing behind that? So that's what he's believing in. The God of science, the God of nature. That's what he's open to. And I want you to know that's more than enough to start, but he doesn't know that yet. And so now we're seeing where he's closed, where he's not open, what he doesn't like. No, I'm not open for this. So with ministers in the world's religions, I parted right there. When they talked of a God personal to me, who is love, superhuman strength and direction, I became irritated and my mind snapped shut against such a theory. How many of us have been like, man, I don't like that idea of a bearded man in the sky, right? And by the way, if your vision or idea of God is a bearded man in the sky, what I want you to know is, and I genuinely mean that, it is a beautiful place to start. But a lot of people come and they reject that idea, and that is okay. That is okay. What we're going to get to is our conception. Whatever conception we have is enough as just the starting place. And it says, to Christ, I conceded the certainty of a great man, not too closely followed by those who claimed him. And what I want to point out is that Bill Wilson is judging from the gutter. He's absolutely burned his life to the ground like I did. And he's lying in the gutter of the wreckage of his life. And he's like, yeah, that Jesus, he was a good guy. Not too closely followed by those who claimed him, because we all know people who are religious who don't live up to that ideal. But one of the things that I know that I can easily do as an alcoholic is judge others. And it's usually when I'm feeling the most insecure, the most filled with that less than ego, that I come to that judgment of others. And how often, again, I dismiss the miracles of those around me in the rooms. How often am I discounting the miracles I see before me? How often am I like, yeah, but that guy's a jerk. In fact, that page gal, she shares for 60 minutes to an hour and a half. By the way, that's how long the study goes. She just won't shut up, right? So, and how often am I willing to dismiss what's right in front of me? And often the judgments that I have tell me more about me than about the people that I'm judging. And it says, his moral teaching most excellent. Yeah, he's got some great ideas. For myself, I adopted those parts that seemed convenient and not too difficult. The rest I disregarded. And just what I want to point out about that, is it possible that Bill Wilson was one of those people where he could not live up to those beliefs that he had? He might not have been the most religious guy, but we know that he had beliefs that he could not live up to and values that he could not live up to. And is that not my experience? Also, Bill Wilson doing that thing that I want to do. Now, he's talking about religion, and I'm talking about 12 steps. But how often have those of us come to the rooms and wanted to do 12-step cafeteria style? What I mean is I'll have that and that, some of that, but absolutely not doing that. Praying and meditating, absolutely not. All of my amends, no. Inventory, that's a little much. I'll just go to meetings, right? How often have I done those same things too? It's a human and normal response. And that's okay, but know that like what I needed to do was to surrender and do all of it, right? And so now he's getting more and more, not defensive, but more and more close to this idea of God. And what he's getting into is the idea of if there is a God, why did these bad things happen? And so he says the wars which had been fought, the burnings and chicanery. And chicanery, what that means is trickery, usually for personal gain. So the lies that people told to get rich and to get power. The religious dispute facilitated made me sick. I honestly doubted whether on balance the religions of mankind had done any good. Judging from what I had seen in Europe, and when he's referring to Europe, he's talking about the First World War. Now, he didn't see combat. He didn't see frontline combat, but he would have seen the effects of combat. And he would have understood very intimately the horrors of that war. And the First World War is the first war where gas warfare was used and chemicals were being spilt, and gas was intentionally being used, and it would just kill absolutely indiscriminately, and just the horrors of that war. And so he's really hammering home there are religious people that have done awful things in the name of religion. And he's saying, if there is a God, why are bad things happening? And so from what I'd seen and since, the power of God in human affairs was negligible. Capital B, capital M, the brotherhood of man, a grim jest. What he's saying is a dark joke. It's a sick joke. If there was a capital D, devil, he seemed, capital B, capital U, boss universal. And he certainly had me, and he is about as closed as he can be right there. And here's what opens him up again. But my friend sat before me, and he made the point-blank declaration that God had done for him what he could not do for himself. And that has been my experience, that God continues to do for me that which I could not do for myself. No worries, I'm glad you're here. And so what we've seen so far is there's a lot of things that get him closed, but what opens him up? What opens Bill Wilson up is his own experience. Right? His experience that he had in Winchester Cathedral, feeling that presence of God. And what's opening him up is the miracle that he sees before him, a recovered alcoholic, an alcoholic who has found the solution, is armed with facts about himself. And it says his human will had failed. And I've got no willpower against that first drink. Doctors had pronounced him incurable. Society was about to lock him up. Like myself, he had admitted complete defeat. If you're writing in your book, you can make a note that was probably Ebby Thatcher's step one, that admitting complete defeat. Then he had, in effect, been raised from the dead suddenly. And I just want to emphasize that suddenly. Again, that it does not take long to get well. It does not take long to have this experience. Suddenly, taken from the scrap heap to a level of life better than the best he'd ever known. And one of the things that I love doing is trying to find descriptions of the spiritual awakening without going to the spiritual appendix. We will go there. I promise we will go there. But I think that's a beautiful description of what a spiritual awakening looks like. A level of life better than one that we have ever known. So from that hopelessness, what happened was Ebby Thatcher. He accepted the hope that was on offer. He worked the steps and very quickly experienced that solution. All right. Had this power originated in him? Obviously, it had not. There had been no more power in him than there was in me in that minute, and that was none at all. That's a powerful sentence. Bill Wilson's drunk on gin. Ebby Thatcher's 2 months sober. 2 months sober, the lights are on, his skin is glowing. He has got a real answer. And Bill can see the power is not him. The power happened to him. So the power is not me. I don't get the power. But what happens is I allow the power to work and flow through me. That's how I like to look at it or visualize it. I'm a big fan of the St. Francis prayer, which speaks about being a channel. Like, so all I'm trying to do is get enough page out of the way. It's a lot of page that can be in the way. To let that power flow through. That's what I want. It's not my power. By the way, this is a small aside. If you're ever up against something, it's like, man, I don't know if I can do that. Or maybe it's like, man, I don't know if I can be nice to my coworker or the in-laws, or I don't know if I can have the courage to say that thing. It's really helpful for me to remember I'm not doing it. I'm just trying to get me out of the way so that God, my own understanding, can work through me. God's doing the heavy lifting, but that's a whole other, we'll get there. And it says that floored me. It began to look as though religious people were right after all. So he's opening up again. Here was something at work in a human heart, which had done the impossible. And that's one of the things, that's one of the places in which the God of my understanding lives, is within. And the idea for an alcoholic to be sober and to be happy at the same time, man, that is nothing less than a miracle. And as he says, my ideas about miracles were drastically revised right then. Never mind the musty past. Here sat a miracle directly across the kitchen table. He shouted, great tidings. Welcome, we're on page 11, just bottom paragraph. So glad you're here, so lovely to see you. And one of the things I want to emphasize is when it says he shouted great tidings, it's that he did no ranting. It's not he shouted great tidings, he wasn't yelling. It's who he was and how he carried himself. That was what was shouting those great tidings. And so I don't know about you, but my experience is what opened me up to the possibility of a belief in a power greater than myself was you. Was you. You were happy and you were sober at the same time. And you said that a God of your own understanding, that God made that possible for you. And that wasn't enough for me to believe that maybe I wasn't so special, that this thing couldn't happen for me. That was it. And I hope maybe that's your experience too, that was what opened you up. And he says, I saw that my friend was much more than inwardly reorganized. This wasn't some guy who had done a little bit of work and he had really worked on his anger and took care of that procrastination. I mean, we'll deal with that later. It wasn't just the same guy. It says he was on a different footing. His roots grasped new soil. And I just love that. His roots grasped new soil. What we're saying is, imagine, and we're not done with the tree metaphors. There's more tree metaphors to come. But the roots grasping new soil, the depth of who I am is planted and grounded in something completely different. That's what we're after here. It's not like, this is not just Ebby, our good old friend Ebby. No, Ebby's grounded in something different. And it says, despite the living example of my friend, there remained in me the vestiges of my old prejudice. He's still not down for organized religion. The word God still aroused a certain antipathy. When the thought was expressed that there might be a God personal to me, this feeling was intensified. I didn't like the idea. I could go for such conceptions as capital C, capital I, creative intelligence, capital U, capital M, universal mind, or capital S, capital N, spirit of nature. But I resisted the thought of a capital C, capital H, czar of the heavens, however loving his sway might be. I have since talked with scores of men who felt the same way. And so again, he's kind of open to the God that is the spirit of the universe, a God of science, a God of nature, this big God. He's the idea of a close personal God. That's what he's close to, and that is okay. My friend suggested what then seemed a novel idea. He said, why don't you choose your own conception of God? And this is a powerful moment. That statement hit me hard. It melted the icy intellectual mountain in whose shadow I had lived and shivered many years. I stood in the sunlight at last. And one of my favorite metaphors for God in this whole book is God is light, right? And so he was shivering, cold, and in the darkness, in the shadow of this mountain, and suddenly he's in the sunlight, he's in the light. From hopeless to a bit of hope. And it says it was only a matter of being willing to believe in a power greater than myself. Nothing more was required of me to make my beginning. I saw the growth. We're not stopping here. The growth could start from that point upon a foundation of complete willingness. That's an important foundation. And that is the foundation. And it is okay if I am not completely, perfectly willing. I can always pray for willingness. I can always ask for willingness. I might build what I saw in my friend. Would I have it? Of course I would. And so we can make a note that this is Bill Wilson's step 2. Step 2 says, came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. All I've got to believe is that there is a power greater than myself. And that's what he says in the italics. It was only a matter of being willing to believe that there is a power greater than myself. That's it. That's it. And that could restore him to sanity, relieve the mental obsession. When he says that I might build what I saw in my friend. I might have the experience that my friend Ebby Thatcher had. So that is Bill Wilson's step 2. And he goes on to say, thus, I was convinced that God is concerned with us humans when we want him enough. And the note that I always make is that I have to seek God. See, step 2 is not the finish line. Step 2 is the starting blocks of a lifelong race that I've never done. Step 2 is about just believing that a miracle is possible, a spiritual awakening could happen. I've got some work to get there. I've got to hustle, because in step 1, I learn, and we will learn and go through that I will die if I do not have a spiritual awakening. I will drink again. And so what I have to do is I have to seek God. And how I ultimately seek God is all 12 steps. It's a way of life. Like my life depends on it, because it does. And it says the real significance of my experience at the cathedral burst upon me. Again, we're referencing step 1, that moment when he's in Winchester Cathedral and he feels the nearness of God. For a moment, I had needed and wanted God. There had been a humble willingness to have him with me, and he came. But soon the sense of his presence had been blotted out by worldly clamors, mostly those within myself. And so it had been ever since. How blind I had been. And so that's part of why we have the steps. The steps are a course of action, a series of actions that I take that allow me to clear away the stuff that is inside of me, that is blocking me from the God of my understanding. And God is, my experience, God is here, God is present, and the steps are just clearing that away. And when it says worldly clamors, mostly those within myself, what are we talking about? Well, for me, it's the resentments. For me, it's the fears. For me, it's the guilt. It's the shame. It's the remorse. It's that stuff inside of me that's cutting me off from the God of my understanding. So it says at the hospital, I was separated from alcohol for the last time. He's hospitalized December 11th, 1934. Treatment seemed wise, for I showed signs of delirium tremens. And just something that I want to point out and something that I want to offer is that Lois actually was pissed. She was not happy to find that Bill Wilson had gone to the hospital for the 3rd time, because she had accepted that it was hopeless. And she's like, oh, how are we going to pay for this? You know what I mean? And because that's how bad it had gotten. And so what we're going to see is we're going to see Bill Wilson take the steps. I'm going to point out where the steps are and where he takes them. And so it says, there I humbly offered myself to God as I then understood him, to do with me as he would. I placed myself unreservedly under his care and direction. I admitted for the first time that of myself I was nothing, that without him I was lost. And that is Bill Wilson's step 3. And so you can make a little note in your book, step 3, yeah. And one of the things, here's the thing, I love pointing out sneaky promises, and I love doing a lot of things. I love going through the book. I love pointing out sneaky promises. I love pointing out sneaky prayers. I love describing the spiritual awakening without going to the spiritual appendix. Love doing that sort of shenanigans. But if you're looking for a prayer, we can use Bill Wilson's 3rd step prayer. And so how I say it is, I say, God, I offer myself to you, to do with me as you would. I place myself unreservedly under your care and direction. I admit that of myself I am nothing, that without you I am lost. That's how I say it. And I just love sneaky little prayers like that. So that's his 3rd step. He's made the decision. He's signed the deal with the prayer. He's going to work these steps. It says, I ruthlessly faced my sins. Now, whenever we see that word sin, we can, and we're not going to see it too many times in this book, but if I'm approaching spiritual literature, I can just think defective character. That's what we're talking about. Because what is a defect? It's just the stuff that blocks me off from God, right? I admitted for the first time, oh, sorry, I lost my place. I ruthlessly faced my sins, defects, and became willing to have my newfound capital F friend. We're talking about God. And if you're looking for another word to use instead of God, if you have a lot of baggage with that word, you can use the word friend, capital F, friend. So became willing to have my newfound friend take them away, root and branch. We're not done with those tree metaphors. Root and branch, that doesn't mean a little trimming. That means taken away utterly and completely. If I don't do a lot of gardening, but I feel like if you're gardening and pulling out the weeds, you want to make sure you get all of the weed, all of the root, otherwise it'll grow back. So he's willing to have the God of the understanding take it away. It's God that does the removing, root and branch. Have not had a drink since. My schoolmate, that's his friend Ebby, visited me, and I fully acquainted him with my problems and deficiencies. And this might be a little out of order, but essentially what it is it's steps 4 through 7, right? And when he's willing for God to take it away, that's his step 7. He's sharing that stuff with his friend Ebby, that's step 5. We made a list of people I hurt or toward whom I felt resentment. That's going to be his 8-step list. And it says, I express my entire willingness to approach these individuals admitting my wrong. Never was I to be critical of them. I was to write all such matters to the utmost of my ability. And when he goes out to make those amends, that's his step 9. I was to test my thinking by the new God consciousness within. Common sense would thus become uncommon sense. I was to sit quietly when in doubt. I'm just going to, 2 things. One, this paragraph is all about step 11. It's all about step 11. And I just want to point out, sitting quietly would be a meditative exercise. So we have to meditate. Meditation. And it says, sit quietly when in doubt, asking. So what is that? It's a prayer. Asking only for direction and strength to meet my problems as he would have me. And again, if I'm looking for a sneaky prayer, can I not turn that into a prayer? God, I ask for direction and strength to meet my problems as you would have me. I just love pointing those out. And it says, never was I to pray for myself, except as my request bore on my usefulness to others. Then only might I expect to receive. But that would be in great measure. Now, how are you guys doing? Because I say we like to do between an hour and an hour and a half. Are we feeling like we want to finish Bill's story, or do we want to stop here? Because if we stop here, it's a natural stopping point at step 12. What do you guys think? Do you want to keep rocking and rolling, or do you want to call it at the hour? We'll need some sort of indication. Okay, time out. All right. So thank you. Because without any indication, I have to, well, not I have to make a decision. What I can do is I can ask only for direction and strength to meet my problem of whether or not I stop here, as God would have me. All right, so we'll pick it up at step 12 next week, and it's his step 12. It's exciting, and it's a really great place to pick up. So